Okay, so to kick off this review, let's get the obvious out of the way. I'm sure at least 50% of you who are watching this video right now are probably saying to yourself, okay, here we go again. Another review on a set of compact two-way mini monitors. I mean, how special can these relatively ordinary looking speakers actually be? And if that's you right now, I totally don't blame the sentiment because truth be told, there's only two reasons why I brought this product in for review. Number one is the promise of big sound from a fairly compact package. And then number two is going to be the promise of it sounding really good even against a wall boundary. Now, the last part is what intrigues me the most because finding a small speaker that can deliver big sound is no longer unusual. In fact, as a lot of you know, the Bacard Audio S400 is a shining example of this. However, the Bacard S400 has a compromise, which is if you want to get the best performance out of it, you need to give it room to breathe. You need to pull it a good 3 to 4 feet out into the room away from any wall boundaries in order for it to sound its best. But this speaker is supposed to do something very similar, only when placed against a wall boundary and or near a wall, which to me represents more of a real-world solution because this is what most people can actually accommodate. And that leads me, of course, to this speaker. So what you're looking at is the Legend 5, which is the entry into the System Audio flagship lineup. But first, if you're not familiar with System Audio, all you really need to know is that they're a Danish loudspeaker manufacturer that was founded in the early 80s. And what we're looking at, as I just mentioned, is the entry into their flagship line. And as I also mentioned, it is a compact two-way rear-ported bass reflex design. So now let's take a look at the driver configuration. Up top, we are going to have a 1-inch soft dome tweeter housed inside this waveguide. And as some of you already know, waveguides have their benefits. You get controlled directivity when designed right. It lowers the frequency response of the driver so you can have better integration between the tweeter and the woofer. You're supposed to get better power handling characteristics and overall slightly better efficiency, which all goes towards the goals of delivering big sound from a small package. Beneath that, we are going to have a really cool woofer. So basically, System Audio is trying to have their cake and eat it too with this design. The membrane itself is made out of a carbon fiber material, which is very light and rugged, so you're going to get that quick responsiveness from the driver. But because of the ruggedness of material and this thick rubber surround, what you're going to get is something that also exhibits excellent power handling. So that's pretty cool. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to turn around the cabinet. If I didn't mention it before, this is a 5-inch woofer. You're going to have a curved cabinet. You're also going to have this little cutout with a wood overlay here, which is really nice. It kind of gives it this subtle, classy look. And on the back, we are going to have our rear port. We're going to have holes for a wall mounting bracket if that's what you have to do. We have our metal plate with a set of 5-way binding posts, and that's going to be it. Oh yeah, the price. So these speakers retail for $1,795 US a pair. We'll just round up and call them $1,800 a pair. Anyways, with that said, let's talk about how they actually perform. Okay, so for this section, what I'm going to do is first give you an idea of the speaker's overall sound profile, the kind of performance that you would likely run into if you were to try it for yourself. After that, I'm going to touch upon the claims that I mentioned earlier on in the review to check on if the speaker actually meets them, and then I'm going to go into more detail about the speaker's overall performance envelope. But first, about its general character. So when you listen to the speaker, you're going to notice that it is not neutral, nor is it going to be warm and rolled off. Instead, this is a very lively, dynamic sounding speaker. The top end is going to be boosted. The upper mid-range is going to be a little bit thin, and the rest of the presentation is going to be fairly neutral, except the bass can take on a warm character, especially as you place the speaker closer to a wall boundary. Now, it's not going to be as light sounding as, say, a Dolly. There is going to be a little bit more richness and fullness to the character. But overall, that's what you're going to get from this speaker. Now, about the claims. Number one, can this speaker fill a big room with an adequate amount of sound? Well, to test this out, I had to take them to my parents' place where they have a much bigger room. I'm talking about something that's, I think it's around like 30 by 60 feet. I mean, it's a huge space. And overall, I would say the answer is mostly. So here's the thing. Can this speaker fill a big room with a lot of sound? Yes, it can. Can it play at fairly loud volumes in this big room? Yes, it can. However, if you're going to play demanding music like hip-hop or EDM and you're expecting a visceral presentation, it's not going to do that. It's going to play louder than you would expect a small speaker to play, especially in a big room. Don't expect miracles out of it. Next, number two. can the speakers sound good next to a wall boundary? And overall, I would say the answer is yes. Now, don't get me wrong. When you place a speaker directly against a wall, you're going to sacrifice the usual things, such as depth within the soundstage. Obviously, now the wall is almost serving as your baffle area, so no, you're not going to get that. But overall, the performance remains fairly balanced given the voicing that they were going for. And yeah, it can actually sound very, very good in that environment. And that leads me to the individual characteristics of his performance, starting with the treble. This is going to be where we're going to have the most notable amount of coloration. And like I said, it is bumped up. Now, this does a few things for you. Number one, if you like to listen at low volumes, this speaker is fantastic because all that detail, all the information is just right there. I wouldn't say it's in your face, like I said, of clip speakers, but it's not necessarily laid back either. Instead, the sound overall projects in a forward way, just slightly in front of where the speakers are going to be physically located. And for people who like a lot of treble information, which is a lot of you, the most popular speakers on the market right now actually have that voicing, then this is something that you're really going to enjoy. Now, it doesn't have that sharpness of a metal dome tweeter, but it's not going to be as sibilant as one would imagine. It's just a very forward-focused sounding speaker with a lot of detail that's going to sound great at low volumes. But, of course, if you listen to bright components, bright music, then you're going to get a very, I wouldn't say a very bright sounding presentation, but again, it's going to be tilted up. Next, let's talk about the mid-range. So the mid-range is interesting in the sense that, like a lot of mini monitors, the upper mid-range at the crossover point's just a little bit thin, but the rest of the mid-range is pretty neutral. Now, on one hand, you do get that slightly nasal quality out of vocals. They're not going to have that same fullness and richness that you'll get from a speaker that doesn't have this voicing. But overall, again, as always, the compromise is that you get a sense of depth from this speaker, a sense of layering within the soundstage that you're not going to get from most other speakers that aren't voiced this way. And overall, the mid-range is going to be very pleasant. There's just a little bit of fullness to the tone that keeps it from sounding anemic and too thin. And then we have the bass. The bass is going to be strong. Now, the bass is going to be more about quality output versus giving you a tremendous amount of bass. And I need to emphasize this because I know some people are going to ask, well, Sean, do I need a subwoofer with it? Well, I'll say this. If you're in a smaller room, maybe not. But if you listen to any bass-heavy music, whether it's rock and roll, whether it's, again, EDM, hip-hop, then you might. Quite frankly, you might. But at least you know that the output of the speaker is going to be good enough to keep up with a lot of subwoofers. In other words, the speakers themselves shouldn't bottom out unless you're listening at incredibly loud volumes, which is a compliment to their design because most small speakers just can't do that. Now, tonally speaking, as I mentioned before, the bass will take on a slightly warm tone when you put it next to a wall boundary. But overall, yeah, it's going to be very quick. It's going to be clear. I don't think too many people are going to have an issue with the bass. Dynamic output is going to be exceptionally good for a speaker this size, maybe the best that I've heard from a non-horn bookshelf speaker. It can move a lot of air in a very short amount of time, and when you listen to particularly classical or even certain jazz pieces, right, it does an exceptional job of keeping up with some of the more demanding parts of that music. Imaging is going to be very good. As you would imagine from any compact two-way monitor, it's going to lay down a wide soundstage. It can have really good focus in between the speakers, but you do need to toe them in just a little bit. And in fact, that leads me to some setup tips for these speakers and how to get the best sound out of them. Let's talk about that. And a cloud just went overhead, meaning that this video probably got a whole lot darker than it was just a few seconds ago. Anyways, the good news is that it doesn't really require a whole lot of time and effort to get good, consistent performance out of the Legend 5s. In fact, this is one of the easier speakers to work with. If you have to place it next to a wall, it's going to work out just great. The only thing that I would recommend is to use a quality stand underneath the speakers, something from the likes of ISO Acoustics. And this is because the Legend 5 produces a lot of energy, and you're going to want something underneath it to absorb some of that resonance instead of just putting it on a flat shelf. For those of you out there who are running more of a traditional hi-fi rig, then you're going to want the speakers to be at ear height, meaning that the drivers should be in line with where your ears are going to be. Now, don't get me wrong, these speakers have great off-axis performance, but if you want to get the best sound possible, then you have to treat them like every other speaker, which would mean using 26 to 28 inch stands. Now, when it comes to positioning within a room, I think you can get away with as much as 3 to 4 feet out from any wall boundary and still get really good performance out of them. And I also prefer the sound of these speakers with a pretty decent amount of toe in, to where the drivers are facing at or even a little bit into your shoulder area. This is when you're going to get that locked in center soundstage. Anyways, now it's time to talk about equipment matching. First, let's go over power. I know the specifications would suggest that these are slightly difficult speakers to drive, but really and truly they're not, and a lot of this has to do with their voicing. So if you're somebody who uses, say, modest powered tube amplifiers, like a 15 watt per channel tube amp or higher, and you're somebody who likes to listen at fairly modest volumes in a small room, you can get away with that with these speakers. They're actually very, very easy to drive, especially given their size and given their relative full range output. Again, for their size. But for most other people, I would say this. If you're in a larger room, go with 100 watts per channel or higher. And if you're in more of a modest sized room and you listen at sane volumes, let's say 90 dB or lower, then a good 50 to 60 watts should be good enough for you. Now, when it comes to good matches in terms of tone, I would say that for me personally, I would recommend amplifiers that are voiced to be either neutral or something that has more of a smooth and warm character to it. When you pair it up to gear like this, it's going to kind of counterbalance that slight thinness in the upper mid-range. Good examples would be, on the affordable side, Denon integrated amplifiers have this trait. The Iotavx is going to be a good neutral-ish voiced affordable component. If you want this really warm and almost effortlessly detailed presentation and you want a purist piece, the Dayan's Ampino is a good match. On the more expensive end, you can find Hagel integrated amplifiers. That's a really good match. The Denafrips, Hestia, and Hyperion separates combination, again, another good match. But this is more in the direction that I would take people in. Anyways, guys, I think that's about it. So now it's time to talk about the caveats. Okay, so most of the compromises about the Legend 5s are pretty straightforward. I mean, number one, while a lot of people are going to like that tilted up top end and its liveliness and its sense of effortless detail, not everybody is going to like it. In fact, if you're into more of a smoother or more neutral presentation, then there's going to be other speakers out there that you will prefer. Next, if you're somebody who has room to work with, in other words, you can pull the speaker a good 3 to 4 feet out into your listening space, then there's going to be other solutions out there that will be just as good at filling a room with a lot of sound, only they likely won't have that same dip within the upper mid-range that these speakers do. Next, let's talk about the price. In the world of hi-fi, they're definitely not expensive, but at $1,800 a pair, this puts them out of the reach of many listeners. And then lastly, system audio may be fairly commonplace in Europe, but outside of this market, it may be nearly impossible to audition these before you make a purchasing decision. But there is good news on that front. So System Audio, like a lot of other companies, will allow you to buy them directly from the company. They'll ship it to your home, and you'll have 30 days to make a determination as to whether or not they're for you. And if you decide they're not, they'll pay to have the speakers shipped away. So at least it's a fairly risk-free way of trying things out. And if you do decide to keep them, they back their speakers up with a 7-year warranty, which is actually pretty good, especially considering that this company has been around for a while and likely isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Anyways, that's going to be it for the compromises. So now I'm just going to wrap up this review with my final thoughts. Alright, so as I did with the last review, I'm going to wrap up this video by giving you my subjective thoughts on the System Audio Legend 5. So, on one hand, I feel like System Audio did a great job of realizing their primary goals with this speaker, because what you're getting is something that's compact, that can output quite a bit of volume, that's very dynamic and very clear sounding from top to bottom. And if you like that lively presentation, let's just say you're somebody who likes the sound of B&W or Focal, or maybe you like the sound but you don't really like that metallic tone that you get from some of their speakers due to the use of the metal dome drivers, well, this is something that you may absolutely fall in love with. And what's also cool is the fact that these speakers are very easy to work with. So if you're somebody who listens at soft volumes, and maybe you're running an EL84 or EL34 tube amplifier, This, in my opinion, is where the system audios sound the best. You get this liveliness, you get this great presence to the sound. Some of the weaknesses of the speaker aren't really that obvious at this volume level, I would say, at and below 75 dB. That's where it's a great match. But if you like to listen at louder volumes and you have a larger room to fill and you still want a high-end presentation, these speakers, again, are going to be a really solid solution, provided, of course, you keep your expectations realistic. I mean, no, again, they're not going to deliver visceral mid-range and bass output. That's just not what they're capable of doing. But they can play very loudly and very cleanly given their size. However, on the flip side, obviously, they're not going to be for everybody, and I don't mind saying this. They're not for somebody like myself because I like a presentation that's a little fuller in the upper mid-range. I like a presentation that's going to be more neutral, a little easier on the ears. Don't get me wrong, I like liveliness, but not all the time. But not everybody feels the way that I do. And if you're somebody who does prefer that kind of a presentation, then this could be something worth checking out. Anyways, guys, that's going to be my take on the Legend 5s. Now, I know at the end of my reviews, I typically have comparisons for you guys, but I'm not going to have that this time around because I want to make a dedicated video about how these speakers compare to other popular models in this range, namely the Bacart Audio S400s and the recently reviewed Dynaudio Evoke 110. So that video is going to come out probably a week from now, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.